Okay, so I'm going to tell you a little bit about the HSI work that we have done and why we started putting on HSI 101. What you're going to get today, and from me at least, is like a very, very short version of an introduction that we do in our faculty and staff development workshops that we have done. And so many HSIs now, mostly across the Southwest, but look at where there's a new pocket of HSIs. Eastern Washington. So yeah, Yakima Valley College, we've been to Central Washington and Tri-Cities area, there are new HSIs. So as you know, HSIs, we're taking over, right? We serve almost 2 million Latinx undergraduate students in the US. Whisper to your neighbor, what percentage of Latinx students attend an HSI? Of all Latinx students that are attending a higher education institution, how many are at an HSI? Whisper to your neighbor. You don't have to tell me. What do you think it is? 80%, 20%? All right, so the real number is, dun, 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 it's like 60 something, right? 63. Who got it? I know. Sometimes people are like, it's 100%. No. But if we're in the 60s, that means if we're going to move the needle on Latinx student success, where are we going to move the needle? In HSIs, right? In HSIs. We are the people that are going to produce equity. So I just want you to all feel super empowered right now that you are the Latinx equity people in the nation right now. So what we do in HSIs is what non-HSIs should be copying. Not the other way around. Not the other way around. So we're leading. We're leading the way with these best practices. So I think you should feel empowered by that. Okay, another little interesting graph that I got from Pew is to look at how Latinx students are doing in high school, which is another reason we have so many HSIs. So they're actually completing high school and enrolling in college in greater numbers than ever before. So what have we done a good job at? Getting them there, right? Access used to be the conversation of early HSI conferences. How to get students to come to your school. Is this a problem anymore? Not so much. Not so much. You see the conversation now turning to strategic pathways, like when students come, what can we do? Not like getting them there. They're already coming. So really, I've seen the conversation shift in the last 10 years to, okay, access is not a problem. They know they're going to college. Their families are sending them to college. That's not the question anymore. The question is now, what do we do that they're here? But now we see that there's still a graduation equity gap between Latinx students and Black students, and overall, the graduation rates for everybody. So this is now the focus of study, is they're not completing in the same numbers we'd like, they're not transferring in the same numbers that we like, so what is going on? Is there something wrong with them? Is there something wrong with HSIs? And I bet you anything that non-HSIs, and Gina can tell you more about this, when she goes to conferences that aren't just HSI focused, that they don't talk very well about HSIs, right? So we're also in this mix, but people are saying, hey, maybe there's something wrong with the college they're going to, and that's why they're not completing. Is that true? No way. Okay, so here's your next question. In your opinion, I'm going to read these to you because it's probably pretty hard to see from the back. In your opinion, which of these actions should be your HSI's top priority to fulfill its mission as an HSI or emerging HSI? Okay, A would be advertise that you're an HSI on the website, marketing materials and press release, like announce that we're an HSI. That should be our top priority. The second one, B, would be analyze the achievement gap, our own institutional achievement gap between subgroups of students. Maybe we need to do it on pathways, courses, departments, as well as the institution overall. So that would be B. You can go ahead and enter this whenever you want. C is increase the number of student support programs and validating spaces for Latinx students on our campus. So really like make a welcoming space, make places for them. And the last one is shift from deficit to asset-based thinking about our Latinx students and the surrounding community. I want to see which one you really feel like is the most important thing for you guys to do at your institution. So it looks like almost half of you believe the last one would be the best way for you to start your journey or continue on your journey. is to change from deficit to asset-based thinking. That'll be interesting to hear about when we do our case studies later today. But all of these are important, right? None of these should be like left off the list, but definitely when you work on this last one, this deficit to asset-based thinking, you're going to be doing some different stuff. Your actions are going to follow that. Okay, what we know from our work with HSIs, I work for the organization called Escala. We do a lot of work with HSIs all over the country, so we have a lot of empirical data from working with faculty and staff from these colleges. And one of them we realized is that enrollment in HSIs isn't just about Latinx students. HSIs are incredibly diverse. They serve a very big population of students of color. And then HSIs aren't all the same. So if you're new to the HSI world, don't go assuming it's all 2 years, because that is not what's happening. In fact, a lot of 4-year HSIs are coming on board. The Cal State system, UC, UT. So there are HSIs that fall into this thing. It's really hard to see this, you guys, but it says big systems. So big systems are now becoming HSIs. Research one institutions are becoming HSIs. So it's changing the conversation a little bit. All right, I'm going to run through quickly some best practices slides to just get your brain thinking as Gina goes through her typology. And one of them is that these are a big best practice is that your HSI should be looking at everything disaggregated as much as possible. And so when we work with faculty, we teach them how to disaggregate their course data. Because a lot of faculty just get told, here's your pass and fail rate, done. And if they don't know how their Latinx students did versus the whole class, or if they don't know how their African American students did with their Latinx students. So if you don't disaggregate the data, you're not getting the full picture of equity of what's going on in your classroom. So Celia Hurtado, who is really like the godmother to me of HSI research, is saying that successful HSIs all share one thing. They look continuously and monitor the completion, transfer, and retention rates of Latinx students as a commitment to improving everybody's success. So it's not like you're just taking them aside and going, we only care about you because we're an HSI. Do you guys have colleagues that say that? Hey, it feels like we're just being totally racist right now, guys. And I get a lot of faculty that say, I feel really weird looking at my data only by ethnicity. That's kind of weird. But you tell them, this is what HSIs do. We're trying to improve equity, so we want to look at how everyone is doing. Okay, so a couple more of these best practices. So obviously you need to have conversations, right? You need to have conversations with your colleagues where these things bubble up and they get put on the table. If those questions that were there, if those like fester under the surface, all the programs, all of the grants, what's gonna happen to that? Is it gonna work? If people are like questioning, like, can all our students succeed, by the way, that's another good conversation to have. Do you all believe that your students can succeed in your colleges? And I know you do. But there are probably some folks at your institution that they don't even know that's kind of something that they feel under the surface. So you gotta have these conversations. They're not fun. So how are we using our students' assets? How are we using our community's assets? How are we maybe talking deficitly, even about our own community and where their students are coming from, and how do we shift that conversation to an asset-based one?
Alrighty, y'all. So I'm Gina Garcia, and I'm gonna talk y'all through the next part of the workshop, which is what we're gonna talk about is how do you move from this idea of enrolling to serving. All right, so the typology of HSI, organizational identities. So I think about identities, HSIs having an identity. All right, so it's kind of like all of us have identities, right? And we all have different identities, right? So if I ask you, how do you identify racially, right? I'm like, how do you identify racially? You know, they're gonna tell me their racial identity, right? How do you identify? They're gonna tell me theirs, right? How do you identify? They're gonna tell me theirs, right? Everyone's gonna tell me their racial identity, and it's probably gonna be different, right, than what we look at. Right, so I could look at all y'all and be like, you're brown, you're white, you're raza, you're Chicano, right? I can start naming all these different things, but you get to decide who you are, right? And so that's how I think about the HSI identity. HSIs get to decide who they are. Nobody else gets to, all right? This is an assets-based way of thinking. Melissa has been talking about asset-based of your students. I talk about HSIs as asset-based, right? Like the entire, we got to think about HSIs as asset-based as well, right? So you allow HSIs to identify. The federal government, all they said was you got to have 25% Latinx students. That's it. The things that the federal government is asking has nothing to do with whether or not you're serving the students well, right? So you just do your reporting and then they send you your $500,000, right, for the next year, like thanks, right? But really, the federal government isn't defining this, right? Y'all are defining this, and that's the cool thing is like, you know, it comes from within. It's very grassrootsy, I think, right? So the HSI organizational identity, I think about it as an identity, and it's part of your other identities. The organization identity, let me talk a little bit about the research, all right? So there's a ton of research out there on HSIs, looking at HSIs, and Melissa talked a little bit about outcomes, right? Academic outcomes. And a lot of you probably think about academic outcomes. And so let me talk a little bit about the literature. So when you go into the literature, people basically have conceptualized an HSI identity around outcomes, around academic outcomes, right? So I have all these folks here. If you want to look at the research, these folks here have basically said academic outcomes determine whether or not you're an HSI. So if you graduate students in equitable numbers, you're an HSI. If you graduate Latinx students in equitable numbers, you're an HSI. All right, now what we have found, this here plus negative equals, is that the research actually is really, really not consistent. Right, so depending on which article you read, some people would say the 6-year graduation rates at HSIs are greater than non-HSIs. Some would say they're worse than HSIs, and some would say they're equal to. And that's because these folks over here, some control for really important institutional variables, like your incoming data. All right, so the thing that determines whether or not students graduate more than anything is what they bring in, right? So you have to think about your incoming variables. I worked for the Higher Ed Research Institute, and we always think about incoming variables, always, right? You gotta think about your incoming variables. So that's not an organizational thing. That's your students, right? Dealing with your students, all right? And thinking, okay, whatever they bring into the institution, that's gonna actually determine the outcomes, unless we do something in the environment to disrupt that. Right? So if you know your students came in at lower than college-ready math, okay, cool, we're gonna deal with that. We understand, we think assets from assets-based perspective, and we're gonna deal with that, right? And we're still gonna graduate them, right? Because we're an HSI and we're gonna do this work, and we're committed to doing this work, and we're committed to being committed to our students no matter what they come in with. Non-academic, these are folks that have said, oh, these non-academic things make you an HSI. So students that go to HSIs, this is some of the work I've done, they are more aware of their racial identity when they leave. All right, and that's what some of us have found, is like they actually are, right? That they spend more time getting to know who they are as racialized people at an HSI than they would at a non-HSI, right? For a variety of reasons. So that's what these say. So these folks would say those things matter and those things make you an HSI, right? Over here we got culture. These are the cultural elements. And when I get to the typology, you understand why there's outcomes in culture. These are the folks that have said, well, the campus culture is inviting, it's welcoming, we create a sense of belonging for people. That makes us an HSI because people can speak in Spanish. There's faculty that speak Spanish. There's administrators that speak Spanish. There's other students that speak Spanish. That makes us an HSI. It feels like an HSI. It feels good, right, to be a Latinx student at this institution. That's culture, right? Campus climate, we've found some mixed outcomes on campus climate, whether or not the campus climate is any better at HSIs. And I say we because me and my colleagues have done some of this work and have found, one thing I really have thought a lot about is that there's pockets, right? So there's some places where your students feel really welcomed and belong. They're like, yes, I love it. In the trio office, it's dope, right? Like I feel like I belong. But then over there in the like, I always pick on STEM. In my science class, always pick on STEM. Anybody in the STEM area? I always picking on STEM, y'all. Always. So y'all better change it up for STEM, all right? Over there in science, oh man, I feel horrible over there, right? There's microaggressions going on in the classroom. It's terrible, right? So there's these microclimates, right? So that's something y'all gotta think about, is that like in some places it might feel really good, in other places it might not. Right? And that's the reality of campuses because there's so many microcosms, right, on a college campus. And then these folks here talk about culturally relevant practices, which is what Melissa, if y'all haven't brought Melissa Salazar and her team out, that's what they focus on, right? They focus on what you do in the classroom, assets-based curriculum, right? And thinking about students and who they are and recognizing who they are as racialized beings, that matters and that makes you an HSI. right? So all this research, I brought all this research together. So the typology in the article, I talk about these 4 different types of HSIs, right? And really thinking about this idea that it isn't just you enroll or you serve, that there's actually this space in between, and that you could become a different type of HSI, right? So this here, this is the student outcomes, what is this called? AHSIE. I was like, what are these things called? And then this one is the culture, right? So if you have low student outcomes, meaning inequitable, right? We definitely want y'all to think about equity, right? So are your Latinx students completing math, their entry-level math course at the same rate as your white students, right? Are they transferring at the same rate as your white students? Are they graduating in 6 years at the same rate as your white students? We want you to do that kind of equity work, right? Because you want to compare students to students, right? So you want to be like, okay, well, our white students aren't doing that well either, right? Are they doing as well as our Latinx students? Like, who's doing better, right? And do comparisons by race. It matters, right? So what if you find actually the outcomes that we're looking at and we care about, they're low. We're not doing very well. Then you might be in this area, either enrolling or the enhancing. Then you look at your culture and you say, okay, well, do we have cultural spaces for students? Do we have a curriculum? Do we have programs that center their ways of being? Do we have cultural centers? Do we have TRIO programs? Do we have a diversity and inclusion office that thinks about Latinx students? Do we have administrators who are Latinx or faculty, right? All those things contribute to the culture, right? And so some of your campuses might be like, yeah, we do that really well. So we're not graduating students or whatever our academic outcomes are in very inequitable numbers, but we do all those things really well. So I will place you here in this idea that you're enhancing students' cultural and racial ways of being, which arguably is an important thing for HSIs to do, but you're still struggling over here on the academic outcomes. And that's okay, right? Recognizing we do this well, culture, but we don't do this well. So let's focus on moving the needle on the academic side. All right, so this is the typology, and we're gonna have you work with this worksheet to figure out where you're at in the typology, all right? We're all of you are gonna place. And I like the way Melissa was thinking of that. I love talking to Melissa because she's like, I believe in this stuff, right? So we think about like this kind of like a continuum. So maybe you're like really low culturally here, or maybe you're like, we're kind of okay, but we could do better, right? So this can be like a continuum. And then your outcomes, same thing. Maybe you're moving up on the outcomes, right? And we're gonna want you to think about academic and non-academic outcomes, right? We want HSIs to do a lot of stuff. We want you to graduate critically conscious students. We want y'all to graduate students that are out there leading the movement. You see these 11-year-olds leading movements? Wow, I was like, wow, I wish I was like that when I was 11. Jeez, like these kids were like blowing it away, blown out of the water yesterday, right? So we want you to graduate students like that. So these folks here talk about climate and culturally engaging campuses. And they have found empirically that these sort of climate, a positive climate and a culturally engaging campus leads to greater sense of belonging, greater engagement, and greater academic outcomes, right? The research says that this matters. So the continuum, the culture continuum, it matters, right? Because I've struggled with this. I'm like, maybe I'm projecting. Maybe I'm saying HSI should do this sort of cultural thing, and maybe they just got to graduate students. I don't know, right? But this research says it matters that culturally engaging campus and positive campus climate leads to these outcomes. And then I add this box, because we haven't done a lot of great research with this, but I argue in the typology article that like your post-baccalaureate enrollment matters, right? That HSI should be thinking about that. You know why? Because there's like 4% like Latino faculty in all of the US, right? It's horrific. So your HSIs, how many of you have really white faculty? Really white faculty, right? Like super white, like HSI so white faculty, right? That's what it looks like. Why? Because we're not doing a very good job of making our students think that they can go on to graduate school. So if you're not helping your students to believe that they can go on to graduate school, you're doing a disservice to all of us, because we need them to go on to graduate school and get PhDs and get into faculty positions. But we need to be pushing our students into what happens once they leave our institution, right? They got to get jobs. They got to think about graduate school, because we need them. The future, they're our future. We need them to go on to graduate school. Anybody know what the 6-year graduation rate average is for HSIs, 4-year HSIs? 40%, who said that? Yes. Oh, you know this. Yes, it's 39%. 39%, right? So if you're an HSI and you're graduating students in 6 years, greater than 39%, you're doing a good job. Pat yourself on the back, all right? Remember, you gotta compare yourselves to equitable institutions, right? So HSIs, the national average, you know what the national average is? 52, 57, it's in the 50s, right? Depends, each year it changes a little bit, but yeah. So honestly, all institutions are struggling to graduate students in 6 years. That's a little bit, right? All institutions, and that would include your really highly selective institutions. So institutions are struggling to graduate students, all of them. So as an HSI, don't let nobody tell you that you're not doing a good job, because the PWI down the street, they're not doing a very good job either, all right? That's not a very high graduation rate for a national average. Student organizations matter, right? They create sense of belonging for students, right? So I always look at whether or not you have Latino student organizations, right? A lot of HSIs don't, right, at all. I'm like, really? Like, student organizations matter. Latino Greeks, those organizations create sense of belonging for people. They make them feel like they belong at the institution, right? So supporting student organizations is essential, right? That where students can feel like they are valued.